So big welcome to today's topic. This is another foundational topic like the first ones we looked at the beginning of this course. Today we look at culture and why it is important. And like worldview and identity, culture provides the context in which you as a teacher and in which your students view the world. And so if there are differences in your culture and your worldview, and those of your students, that's going to make teaching and education difficult for your students. And as we'll see today, there's quite a number of reasons why your culture will differ from other cultures. One of those reasons is that you're said to live in a modern world. And so the modern worldview that's developed over the last 300 years or more tends to look objectively at the material real world. It's part of an industrial world that's producing objects and items. And if you have a First Nation view of the world, then you may not value aspects of the modern world that people living in the modern world value. Also, there can be a difference between your Christian view of the world and what we might call a secular view of the world, or other views of the world, which could include other religious views, but could also include non-religious views. The challenge with the Christian view is that there are Christian views plural. That is, there are a number of different Christian views. And so you've got to recognize that if your students have different views, that will be different. And then we have the national views. You may come from a particular national group, and then we could have urban versus rural. So urban people tend to see the world different to rural people. And then there is gender, and we could talk about men are from Mars and women are from Venus. So there could be different views of the world there. And then there could be age. So if you're younger, you might have a different view of the world to those who are older. So there's lots of different cultures, and you will be a member of many different cultures. And so you'll communicate from those different backgrounds. How do we define culture? It's collective. It's the message, the program that distinguishes one group of people from another. I've often wondered whether there's a different culture in the different states of Australia. And so it'd be interesting to know whether, is there a different culture in Queensland, New South Wales, or Victoria? Certainly they play different sports in Victoria than here in other states. And so, Ruben, do you think there's any differences in worldview in the different states of Australia?
I think there would be subtle and slight shifts. And I think that especially if you're going further away from New South Wales, such as Northern Territory and Western Australia, you'd start to notice some bigger shifts. But I think you wouldn't notice a direct difference as soon as you cross the border.
And we could raise this in terms of the US of A, which is a bigger population and greater distances in some ways. And again, I think you might find a different culture in the north east of the USA than further south or further west. And so again, there can be different cultures in different parts of the world and different parts of the country. So culture is the lens through which you look at the world and other people look at the world, and teachers will have different cultural perspectives. It's like the backpack or the resource that you carry that gives you the expectations of what you'll wear, eat, speak, how you'll sit, what posture you will have. So culture is important because it influences your thinking, your psychological makeup, what you expect, and this then influences your behavior. So if you're going to visit someone that comes from a more upper level culture, you might dress up a bit. If you're going to visit someone from a less upper level culture, you might dress down a bit. I remember I was once invited to speak at a bikie group to share the Christian gospel message. And as I drove up, I realized, unfortunately, I was the only one driving up with 4 wheels. So immediately I felt left out of it. And then I stepped into the room and I realized that I was the only one not wearing a leather jacket. And so all the way through, I realized there were cultural differences between the way people were thinking and the way people were dressing. And so it's important that we understand the lens of culture through which we see our world and we behave in our world. So we're all situated in a number of cultures. There's a family culture, there is a work culture, there's a national culture, and we interpret the cultures of our own world and those around us according to the expectations that we have. And this leads us to want to associate with people of our own culture. It's more comfortable for you to be with people of your own culture. So there will be guys who want to meet and associate with other guys, and there will be guys with a particular interest. And the reason is you've got all the language. So we have the language, the expectations of our culture. And when we meet with people from another culture, such as us guys, when we meet with women, we don't understand the language of the other culture. And so it's scary for us. And hopefully we're all familiar with the other cultures of men and women, and it's not so scary. But you might go to a dinner party and it will be more comfortable for you to meet with other people who have the same language and expectations you have. But think about this in a classroom. If you have 2/3 of your classroom, people have the same expectations of you, you'll relate well to them. But if you have people in your classroom that have different expectations, you may feel uncomfortable with them. And so that's quite a challenge. So we interpret other cultures through our own culture's values, norms, and expectations. And this then will raise challenges when we try and relate to others. Here's some other cultural differences. Some people are task-oriented. So hands up anyone who's task-oriented. So some people. And some people are social relationship oriented. Hands up those who are social relationship oriented. And Matilda's possibly going to put a hand up several times, and Noah and others. And so relational oriented people may not feel as comfortable with task oriented people. And the same with students. When you've got relational oriented students that want to talk all the time and task oriented students who just want to get on with the task, then you got to realize there can be a cultural gap. Some people are more collectivist. That is, some cultures are more collectivist. They make decisions as a group. Other cultures are more individualistic. They make decisions as an individual person. And again, there can be a disconnect when you meet with people from other cultures. In a collectivist group, there's shame if you don't fit in. And so if you stand out or dress differently, that would be dreadful. There'd be shame. But in an individualistic culture, it can be a good thing to stand out, to dress differently. There's also hierarchical cultures that value older people and qualifications and titles. And there's flat equality cultures that value everyone being the same. There are also high context and low context cultures, which means high context culture, when you say yes, it's not the word yes, but it's the context in which it's given. And in a low context culture, the context doesn't shape the meaning of the word yes, it simply means yes. So if a child comes up to you and says, can I do this? And then you say, yes, that doesn't necessarily mean yes. And so context can shape the meaning of a word in one culture quite differently to another culture. The challenge of culture comes from a day where we receive 11 million pieces of information, and we've got to decide what are the 40, 50 pieces of information that are important. And in one culture, they'll decide these 40 or 50 are important, but in another culture, they'll decide this other 40 or 50 are important. And so in your modern Western urban culture that you're in, you'll choose these to be important. And then in a Indigenous culture, they'll be thinking about these other 40 or 50 pieces of information. And so our brain will process the information in different ways, and we'll feel more comfortable when we're with people who are processing the information in the same way. So we'll see same as safe, and we'll see different as dangerous, because we can make mistakes in our language, in our interpretation, in what we do when we're hanging out with different people, and we'll feel comfortable when we hang out with people who are the same as us. There'll be a danger of misinterpretation when we're with people in a different culture, but people will be friendly and accept us when we're in the same culture, from the same suburbs with the same hobbies. When we're seeking people that we have affinity with, we'll feel comfortable. But when we look at people from a different place, we'll feel less comfortable. And this happens in recruitment. If you're a social person, who will you employ to be part of your company? Social people, because you get on with them. If you're a task-oriented person, who will you employ in your company when you're doing recruitment? Task-oriented. And yet we've shown in other classes that it's important to have diversity. And we see in a biblical passage how important diversity is as well. 1 Corinthians 12, 13 and 14. Can I get you to think about who the four faces here are of these people? And then Jasmine, can you tell us the names of some people in this picture?
Obama.
Yeah.
I think Queen Elizabeth. Is that Queen Elizabeth up the top?
No, it's another British person. Prime Minister.
Oh, I'm not gonna lie, I don't really know any of the other ones. Top right looks a bit like Ellen, but I know it's not Ellen.
Sounds good. So Rachel, who do you see here?
That top left one that looks like Ellen is Prince Harry when he was younger and wasn't bald. And then the one next to him, I believe, is Margaret Thatcher, isn't it?
Yes, well done.
I don't know that bottom one next to Obama, though. Yeah,
Ruben, do you know these ones at all? No. So it's Attenborough, David Attenborough and Prince William. But the point being made here, even though they've changed the eyes and face and twisted it round, we all have instinctive knowledge of cues. And similar with these central dots, these two central dots are the same, but it's the dots around them that shape their view. And so there's a bias that we have. And our brain is triggered by skin color, gender, age, disability, and discrimination is an automatic trigger, because in order to get on in life, we want to know who can we associate with quickly and easily. And if someone's got different skin color, different gender, different age, got disabilities, our brain may trigger, this may not be as easy as we think. Now, of course, in education, we want everyone to be given equal opportunity. So we need to be aware of the discriminations that we hold. And we also need to be aware of the discriminations that students may have towards one another. And so while they may feel comfortable meeting with people the same, we need to introduce them to those who have differences. So in a class, we want to encourage cultural intelligence. We want to encourage cultural competencies, cultural understanding. And to do this, we need to recognize that your interests that bring confidence to you need to be broadened so that you have an awareness of people from different cultures. And so that takes time to meet with people of different cultures, to learn about people of different cultures, to travel and meet with people of different cultures. It takes time to develop a knowledge of people of different cultures. And in a classroom, it takes time to develop strategies to introduce different cultures to your classroom and to honor the different cultures that are present in your classroom. And it also takes strategies to develop action plans in your classroom to introduce different students to the different cultures that are present in their classroom, present in the school, and ways to behave appropriately to them, and to introduce reasons why we feel comfortable with people of the same age and gender and culture and background, and why we find it a bit of a challenge to get to know those who come from a different background. We need to recognise that we're driven by either safety interests or curiosity or interests in other cultures, and we need to understand where cultural intelligence and interest comes from, and we need to understand ways to develop difference in culture. Each of us will have core cultures that we're committed to and flexible cultures. Can I get you to write down some of the core cultures that you are committed to? And some of you will be more organizational, task oriented. Some of you will be more flexible, creativity oriented. For me, I love creativity and freedom and curiosity and humor. They're important to me, I think. They tend to be core of who I am. Maybe there are knots in my system that are hard to untangle. So maybe I'm committed to male ways of viewing the world. Maybe I'm committed to my particular Christian views of the world. And then there are other areas in which I might be more flexible about my views. I think I'm committed to healthy foods. And then there are certain things I may not be so keen to do. And we need to think about what are the core aspects of culture of the students. So different students in your class will be committed to various core aspects of culture. And when you represent and come from a different culture, then you need to be aware of that as well. So Ruben, and then maybe Josie, what are some core aspects of culture and some flexible aspects of culture that you think are part of your approach to the world?
I think definitely when it comes to faith, that'd be definitely at the core.
Yeah.
And then other things I'd say possibly creativity and task oriented.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to faith, how will you respond when you've got a person of no faith in your class? Any thoughts there?
I think that comes down to the whole, you don't, just like any other worldview that they might have, you're not going to have any, I guess, helpful response if you are trying to force. You're just trying to push your worldview onto them. That's not correct, I guess. It's almost a similar tack to what I've taken in my essay. You just need to teach them how to critically think, and then it'll bring them back to the start and go, okay, why do I believe what I believe? And they can shape their own worldview around that.
And you'll also have the challenge, Ruben and others, of bringing the students to respect the person of no faith in their class. And so if you've got a number of others of faith and the person of no faith, you'll be able to speak about the positive benefits of having the person of no faith to see other ways of viewing the world. Josie, any thoughts on what's core in your thinking and what's more flexible?
I definitely agree with Ruben with faith should be at the core of like our culture and identity as teachers. And I think flexibility in like culture comes into having a respectful and open classroom for people with different values and different faiths so that they feel heard. But I think with the flexibility, I think that's room where we can have critical thinking of also what is going in society today and how does like our views fit into that, and is that aligned with what we believe?
Yeah, so good. So you've got to think through what's going on in society and also how the teacher, the school and the students respond to that. So that's very well said, Josie Thea. So it's worth thinking about what's flexible and what's not so flexible in your views of the world. So let's have a bit of a think now about some of the different approaches to culture that we are looking at today and how we're going to respond to these differences. Certainly, if we were to take one state in Australia, New South Wales, 1 in 3 students could speak another language other than English. 1 in 4 could have additional languages as well. 1 in 70 could be refugee. 1 in 12 could be Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander. And there could be many different cultures represented. So understanding contemporary Australian culture in the classroom helps the teacher to build a culturally inclusive teaching approach. And students can explore different questions about the power relations. So do some cultures see themselves as having power over others? Notions of identity. Do we see identity differently? Do we understand the complexity of cultures? And are we careful so as not to promote stereotypes of labeling one culture one way or another? We need to recognize that culture is complex and dynamic. So if you say you come from Pacific Island or Asian culture, we shouldn't oversimplify that. Culture is not the same as identity. And so culture is the general overview of the nation you come from, Africa, Asia, Pacific, but that's not the same as your identity as an individual person or even family or group. They can vary greatly. Culture is a widely contested term. That is, should we promote one particular culture or should we promote mixing of cultures? Do they mix together like a soup? How do we understand the different cultures? How do we value culture? And how do we recognize difference in culture? And the classic is in our modern culture that's time oriented. You've got to start class at 8:30, goes for an hour and then another hour. But what if the Pacific Islander person feels as though we don't need to be so committed to time? What makes one right or not right? And so you've got to understand that these are contested ideas and times. Cultural influences affect our perspectives, our understanding, our identity. Culture then must adapt to migration and also across generation and places and intermarriages. Culture can be expressed in different ways and it's often invisible. It's below the surface. Culture should not define people, and it includes the ways we behave and we think and our being in the world. So there's a lot of different ways in which we need to understand culture. As experienced educators, someone once said that every way of teaching or method of teaching assumes a particular culture. So if I start at 8:30, I put written notes up here, it's not following a culture from another part of the world. The way I communicate reflects a particular cultural approach. Each culture in turn is founded on premises about the natural world. And I guess I'm caught between two cultures, the modernist world, the scientific world, measuring everything world. And then there's my faith world, which also links over to my interest in the humanities and poetry and music and recognizes the value of the unseen world. And I feel a bit like Plato speaking about the value of the unseen world. There are these two different worlds, the worlds of Aristotle and Plato, the worlds of science and humanities. Snow once wrote about the two cultures. And so two cultures, and Snow was the scholar who wrote about the two cultures, C.P. Snow, and he argued that we shouldn't just accept humanities and poetry and art as different from science and mathematics. He said we need a bridge between those two cultures. So part of the problem in modern education is we take a modernist cultural view to the child. They're a material person sitting there. We've got to pour knowledge into them, get a result. We're reducing children to brain animated workers who can get jobs at the end of their years of study. Education is stripped of everything that's human and lasting in value. Education is inculcating students with information. So that's the problem of the modernist world view. The goal of education can be to make children fit in with a particular way of viewing the world. So we're looking at a number of challenges related to culture today. I'm reminded of the Bible passage, Genesis 11, where the people in Genesis 11 said, the whole world is one language and one common speech. And one way of reading this, theologians and Bible scholars say, is that when we seek to make one culture ourselves, we can often get it wrong and exclude others. And a man-made culture can have lots of flaws. So imagine if men ruled the world and made the world in image of men, and how things would be. It would be one way, and we need women in equal number of women in parliament and on boards and running companies. So they said in Genesis 11, let's build ourselves a city, male dominated, oriented city, a tower that reaches to the heavens, and then we'll make a name for ourselves. We don't want to be scattered over the whole earth. So there's something about the questions raised in Genesis 11 about the nature of language and culture can be scattered, and there can be weaknesses in culture and strengths in culture that raises a theological question. How do we understand culture? And one of the things I'm going to suggest today is that there can be room for Christians of a better culture. That is, we're moving from existing cultures to a Christ transforming culture, to a Christ-centered culture. And so Christ is the model of the new culture that we're moving towards there. Ruben, what do you think of the idea that we're moving towards this better culture? And then Josie, we might ask after that. So we're thinking about moving towards a better culture, a Christ-like culture. Is that possible? Or are there dangers in proposing that Christians can call us to the better culture? What are your thoughts, Ruben, and then possibly Josie? Yeah,
I think there's definitely a certain extent that we can become more Christ-like, because that's the journey of a Christian.
Yeah.
And I think as the church, that's what the church is called to do. However, in the world that we're in, and we know obviously because we can read through prophecy and Revelation and stuff, the world will never resolve to be perfect as Christ was. So I think whilst we can try our hardest, it will never fully reach that level. Is that what you're getting at?
Oh, exactly. And I think you raise some very good theological points. Genesis 1 tells us that God makes the world good. And so I think there is something about culture is good, and language is good, and clothing. So if you wear blue jeans, then that may be valuable and good. Hairstyle is good. Makeup may be good. So all of these cultures could be good. I don't know about tattoos. We'll have to ask about tattoos later. So culture can be good. However, Genesis 3 tells us something about the fallen nature of humanity. And it's in this fallen nature that culture gets into trouble. That is, you can use culture to abuse. That is the fallen nature in Genesis 4, Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel. You can use culture to murder, and it can give you a reason to murder, to hate. And the Apostle Paul in Galatians 5 talks about the fruit of the flesh. And so here we have the fallen culture nature in hatred and false stories, but we also have the fruit of the Spirit. And so the Spirit can bring about the better culture. And so I think there's quite solid theological reasons for understanding the goodness of culture in creation in Genesis 1, the fallenness of culture when the flesh nature takes over and distorts it, and then the redemption of culture where it's able to be transformed in various ways. So that raises complex theological ideas there. Josie, do you have any thoughts? And then maybe I could ask Stephanie as well on what do you think of the idea that Christians can bring a view of culture that's beneficial for our society?
Yeah, I think that we do definitely have a very big part to play in that. When you asked the question, I sort of started to think about Matthew 28, where Jesus calls us to build disciples. And I think that's an important role in culture, to be showing the way that God asks us to live. But I also think that our world is a very, very broken world, and it is a very sinful world. And I think that people can view culture as their way of showing their uniqueness. And they think that obviously people know that they're created uniquely, but they try to find themselves in culture in an unhealthy way, I guess.
Yeah, I really like that unhealthy uniqueness. And so at a party, drunkenness, and the Apostle Paul may in fact list that in Galatians 5. And so there can be a culture of drunkenness, and there can be a culture of drug taking, and then there can be a culture of hooning in cars, and so there can be a whole heap of cultures. I don't know whether we can ask the tattoo question as to whether that's a negative culture or not. But Stephanie, what do you think of the thought that Christians can bring about a healthy view of culture, which Joseph said very well, and she also warned of an unhealthy culture that brings a sense of identity, but it's based around less healthy identity practices. Stephanie, your thoughts on the Christian bringing transformation in culture?
I think as Christians, I suppose we have different priorities in our lives. So like, for example, instead of being like here and now focused, we're kind of like future focused, and we have a hope for our future, which I think a lot of modern cultures don't. Like, you know, climate change, all that sort of thing is contributing to like a modern culture, and can cause like that's like potentially detrimental to their outlook in life. Whereas yes, those things are important because we're supposed to, you know, be good stewards of the land and that sort of thing. But we also have a more hope, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's true. Jürgen Moltmann wrote a theology called Theology of Hope. And so it's Jürgen Moltmann, Theology of Hope, in which he put forward that argument that it's this theology of hope that gives us looking forward to a better world. And so Jürgen Moltmann, Theology of Hope, argues that this eschatology, that God's bringing about a better world, and this is meant to motivate us to help the oppressed and the suffering, and it's meant to motivate us to be involved with big issues like climate change, and it's not going to destroy the world. As a matter of fact, Christians should be more actively involved in bringing about the better world. We shouldn't be just accepting carbon dioxide pollution, but we should be motivated to bring about the better world that is possible there. And a number of people have written about the ways in which Christians can contribute to change in society and bringing about the better world in society that can come about there. 1 Corinthians 12 says that just as the body has many members and they're all different. And so if we come from different cultures, whether Jew or Greek, slave or free, the Apostle Paul says that we have the different contributions to make in our classroom and society. And similarly, when we have the parts of the body, the eye, the ear, all of those, they all contribute and play a part. And then in Galatians 3:28, so culture of the Jews is important, but the Apostle Paul in Romans and Galatians writes about the danger If you say we're unique and privileged, then there's a problem. The culture of the Greeks is important, but if you say we're unique and different, there is a problem. And so we need to value culture, but also value difference. The culture of the slave people is different to the culture of the free people. The culture of the male, different to the culture of the female, but we're all one in Christ Jesus. So the Apostle Paul raises some valuable insights there. So these are very important issues. Can I get you to write down, based on what we've looked at so far, what are some things that we need to be aware of as teachers? What can we do based on this information that we've looked at today about culture? So there are certain steps we really should think about taking in the classroom based on what we've said today about culture. We've got to be careful because there's two problems. One is the culture of the teacher, and then the other is the cultures of the students. And so we have these challenges that we face in the classroom due to the culture of the teachers and the culture of the students. What should we be doing in the classroom because of these differences that we have there due to these different cultures, the cultures of the one and the cultures of another? Yeah. What can we be doing? Just while you're writing that down, I might share with you some thoughts on someone who wrote some interesting ideas about culture. And this was Matthew Arnold. And he wrote a book on culture, or essay on culture. And so Matthew Arnold was the son of Thomas Arnold, and he wrote this book on culture. So let's go over to what Matthew Arnold wrote. So he's an English writer, and he was son of Thomas Arnold, who was headmaster of a school known as Rugby School in England. And Matthew Arnold argued that culture is not just about the way things are or the ways people dress or prepare food. It's about the way groups of people understand perfection. That is, you dress a certain way because you honor certain things in order to make a better world. So when you wear blue jeans or when you wear a blue dress, you're saying something about what you see as the perfect world to live in. When you arrange your classroom in a certain way, you're saying something about what this means to have a world that is looking a certain way. So he was a examiner of schools, and he'd go around to schools, and Matthew Arnold will say, this is the sort of school we want. That is, he wanted a school that developed a culture of perfection. That is, you'd learn language to perfection, you'd learn to do art to perfection, you'd learn to do music to perfection, because this is the sort of world that God wants. It's a perfect world. That is, as a Christian, he believed in making a better world through making a better culture. So the pursuit of perfection for Arnold was moral, intellectual, and spiritual journey for the will of God for perfection, Genesis 1, to prevail and to come about. So that's what Matthew Arnold wanted, the perfect world. Now, his father also wanted the perfect world, and I might ask a couple of students in a moment. His father introduced a little sport at the school that he was headmaster of in order to encourage the development of character, etc. So I might ask Josie and then Gabrielle, what sport might Matthew Arnold's father have introduced into his school when he was headmaster in order to make the world a more perfect place.
Didn't you say that it was a rugby school?
The name of the school was Rugby. And so when they developed a set of rules for the playing of football in that school, they called it the Rugby School Rules for Football, which has been shortened to the name of Rugby. And now not only that one school plays that set of rules, all around the world, people may play rugby. And the reason we have that set of rules, because the Christian headmaster wanted Christian ways of throwing a football around. And so the whole idea of this sharing the ball with one another as you charge forward and develop character and teamwork is that you might become a better person, a perfect person. And I suppose for women, you'd have to have women's rugby as well, wouldn't you? So that they too can become perfected like us guys playing football. So it's a fascinating story of a headmaster who was wanting to bring about areas. Can I get you to, going back to the question before, Ruben, what were some of the things that you wrote down in the question that we asked before?
I started thinking about, this is the one talking about how can we look at culture in the classroom today. Was that the one?
Yeah.
I was thinking about, not sure how it would actually work out and apply, but talking about all the different cultures. They've each got strengths in terms of what they'll emphasize for ways of knowing in their fields of knowledge. So I think rounded and fair assessment tasks which apply to different strengths and a variety that's consistent, I guess, possibly.
Oh, exactly. And so if you've got Pacific Island culture, which says time is not so important, so time is not important, there's a benefit in that, in saying time is not important. The Sabbath is a bit like, let's spend the whole day on the Sabbath, realizing we're not pressured by time, we can be more relaxed. And so time not being important is one culture. And then there are other people from the culture where time is important. Your essays must be in at a certain time, word length is important. But there's another culture which says words are not so important. And so we need to value that. And so I think in the class, as Ruben, you've said, it's important to value things that seem strange and different to us from our modern world view. Do you have further thoughts on that, Ruben, as to this strange idea of valuing not sticking to time and not sticking to written words? And you might be able to think of other things in the Indigenous culture. Your thoughts, Ruben?
I'd be happy to not stick to writing words. Time, on the other hand, as we've talked about, being a person who likes time management, that would be, I think I'd find that almost stressful, not having a time to have things done by. I don't know. It'd be hard for me to entertain that thought. But
Rachel, what are your thoughts about what you can do? Did you write some things down, your thoughts, and then there may be someone else who's got thoughts that they've written down as to what can we do in the classroom? And we've got people from Pacific Islands and Papua New Guinea and Asia, and we've got people saying time is not important, that words are not important, that you may be able to think of other cultural differences. What can we do, Rachel?
One thing that actually me and my mental teacher do is we try and we have 3 Sudanese girls and we sit them all together because they prefer to sit together and be like within themselves, and they don't socialize a whole lot with the other class. So we've made it a real effort that anytime we move the classroom, we keep them together, because we know they'd prefer that. They'd actually get more work done sitting with each other and being able to talk to each other rather than, you know, be on opposite sides of the classroom. So they'll also speak in their native tongue during class. And when it's like silent time between partners in groups, you know, me and my mental teacher, we don't stop them from doing that because we see no point in it. like obviously they speak English to us, and any questions they have or presenting anything, they'll speak English, but they'll speak their native language to each other during class, which is actually really fascinating to hear. And they'll go like a million miles a minute when speaking their native tongue, but they like speak really slowly when they speak English, obviously for ESL, but it's really quite interesting to hear them speak to each other.
Yeah, so well said. And in churches, we have the same question. Do you put the age group together, or do you, if you have a youth group that has its entire service, then you'll find that they'll be happier, but they're not mixing with the 60, 70, 80-year-olds as well. And so youth culture as opposed to older people culture in church, this is a real question. And this is a real question. If you come from, say, a Sudanese church, should you go to a Sudanese church, or should you go to a more Western style church? And some people say they want to go to a Western style church because they'll learn more of the Western language, they'll learn more of the Western culture. And other people say, no, we'll enjoy it more if we go to a Sudanese, but then we'll never learn to speak English. So there's a real tension between that question, which you raised very well there. Sitting students together has lots of benefits, but it also raises that challenge of slowly learning the language as well. So that's a very big challenge, a very important one. So we'll draw it together there as we take our 10-minute break. We've seen that we have a real challenge in that we all have different cultures. That is, the teachers, every teacher, in all that we do, we reflect our background culture. So if you're from a particular suburb or a rural area, you speak with that background culture that you have, and that is going to distance people from that culture. If you're a male, then your students who are females may not identify with you, or they may, and the same with female to male. So there are cultures that we have that make it easier or harder to relate to students in the classroom. And then there are cultures that the students have that make it challenging to relate to one another. And when it comes to thinking, we often think from our cultural perspective, and we're not aware. So when we think that time is important, we're not aware that there are other cultures that say not so important. When we think that words are so important, there are other cultures that have other views. So interacting with other cultures can help us to understand the wonder of God's creation, the diversity of God's creation, the need to be more humble, the need to expand our ideas and thinking, to be aware of the other cultures that are out there. And we need to recognize that part of the Christian calling is to bring about the improvement of culture, the health of culture, the bringing about of God's culture, that is the kingdom of heaven, the rule of heaven about to this world. But we have to be aware of the diversity that's there. The kingdom of heaven needs to include children, youth, older people, every age group. Kingdom of heaven needs to include men and women. And so like the Apostle Paul in Galatians and in Romans, this culture that God is leading us into is a very multifaceted culture that needs to be celebrated. And so it's important that we recognize the diversity and recognize our role in bringing about a greater awareness of this diversity of cultures and how it influences us in our thinking and in our teaching. So let's take a break at that point. We'll come back and look further at culture. And then at the end of that session, we'll have a bit of a look at assignment 3 as well. So see you shortly. Thank you.